Community college nurse playing doctor. They didn't know who she was. They had no idea that the woman in the faded scrubs had held a surgical bay for 40 minutes under direct fire, that her hands had sutured arteries while rounds punched through the tent walls around her, that she'd earned a medal most combat soldiers never see. Katie Rodriguez had learned to absorb cruelty the way she once absorbed shrapnel, with discipline, with silence, with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. But Dr. Pierce was different. He wasn't just cruel. He was methodical. And that's when the real nightmare began. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Katie arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 5:53 a.m., her badge clipped to the pocket of scrubs that had been through the wash 300 times. The hospital smelled like it always did, antiseptic layered over stale coffee, with an undertone of something medical that never quite washed away. The parking lot had been empty except for her truck, a 2008 Silverado with 187,000 miles on the odometer and a dent in the driver's side that matched the shape of a chair. She'd gotten that dent 3 years ago, and she still hadn't fixed it. Some marks you keep. The emergency department at Cedar Creek sprawled across the 3rd floor like a warren designed by someone who'd never actually worked in a hospital. Trauma bays on the east wing. Patient rooms bleeding into the central nurse station. Hallways that twisted back on themselves. The smell hit different down here, stronger, sharper, mixed with the metallic undertone of old blood that the housekeeping crew could never quite scrub away. Katie had worked here for 14 months, and she still took the long way to the break room to avoid the supply closet near radiology, the one where the cleaning chemicals made her breathing tight. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this form. Not in this city, not working under her real name. The Pentagon's order had been explicit: Captain Katie Rodriguez was dead. She had no official identity, no service record, no existence in any military database. The classified operation in Bagram had been buried so deep that even the men who'd ordered it were transferred to desk jobs in Washington, forbidden from speaking its name. So she'd become Katie Rodriguez again, just a nurse, just someone who happened to have hands steady enough to hold an artery while it bled and a voice calm enough to talk a panicking resident through a procedure he'd only read about in textbooks. She'd told Miguel once, when he was very small. Showed him the folded flag in her locker, the one from her teammate who died holding the north corner of the surgical tent. Miguel had asked why she kept it if it made her sad. She'd told him it wasn't about sad. It was about remembering who you'd been. Who you might have to be again. He was 7 now, and he didn't ask about the flag anymore. The shift briefing happened at 6:15 a.m. in the cramped conference room next to the medications pharmacy. 7 nurses crowded around a table meant for 5, coffee cups creating rings on papers nobody would look at again. Katie arrived and found the remaining chair, the one with the broken wheel that pulled right, and sat down without saying anything. This was her role here. The quiet one. The one who showed up early and stayed late and never complained and somehow caught things other people missed. Rodriguez, room 312, patients' SATs are dropping, the night shift nurse, Marcus, said while scanning his tablet. His post-op from her appendectomy, been stable all night, but watch him. Something's off. Katie nodded. This was the thing about being invisible. People told you things they wouldn't tell the loud nurses. They trusted you with the details because you didn't take up space. You didn't demand credit. You just listened and remembered and showed up when things got worse. The fluorescent lights flickered as she walked toward her assigned wing. They did that sometimes, a quick stutter that made her left eye twitch. Muscle memory. That's what the VA therapist had called it. The sound of helicopter rotors, or sirens, all those lights, and her body remembered Bagram. Her body remembered incoming. But she breathed through it the way she breathed through everything. One controlled exhale. Move on. Room 347 appeared on her assignment sheet in the hand-off notes. Marine General Martinez, age 72, post-stroke day 3, stable neurologically, PT cleared for bedside chair. The name hit her like a round to the chest, but her face didn't change. She'd gotten good at that. Marcus was already talking about the next patient, about a kid in the pediatric wing who'd swallowed magnets, and nobody noticed the way her hand went still on her coffee cup. General David Martinez had pinned Miguel's corporal stripes on his collar 14 months ago. Katie had watched the video her son had sent from deployment, watched his commanding officer shake his hand and smile at him with the kind of pride that fathers usually give. She'd cried once, alone in her truck, and then she'd put the phone away and gone back to work. She wasn't prepared for him to be here. In this hospital. In her hospital. In a bed. The morning unfolded in rhythms Katie could have executed in her sleep. She moved through the patient rooms like a ghost, efficient, quiet, present only when needed. For checks. Vital signs. Bed sores assessments. The work of hands that knew exactly what they were doing, credentials be damned. Her nursing school had been paid for by the army, her training had been in field medicine under fire, her experience was worth more than any degree hanging on a hospital wall. But the degree hanging on that wall would have been from a prestigious university with a name people recognized. Instead, her credentials said community college, part-time evening program, completed while deployed. She was checking on the patient in room 312, SATs were indeed dropping, likely early pneumonia, she'd note it for the day shift doctor when she saw him. Dr. Pierce. Standing in the hallway with a patient's chart, watching her with the kind of focused attention that made people nervous. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a white coat that probably cost more than Katie's truck payment, with silver at his temples that probably cost money too. His name tag read Dr. Robert Pierce, cardiothoracic surgery, and his eyes were the color of a glacier, blue and empty and profoundly indifferent to everything they looked at. He didn't greet her. He didn't nod. He simply watched while she finished documenting vital signs and then walked past her without a word. She would later understand that this moment, this single moment of him registering her existence, was when the trajectory changed. When he saw something in her competence that he despised. When her quiet efficiency became a threat he could not tolerate. But in that moment she didn't know any of that. She just felt the weight of his stare, and she moved forward. That was the protocol she lived by. Move forward. Don't acknowledge the pressure. Don't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. The morning continued. At 8:22 a.m., Katie approached room 347 to check on the general. His vitals had been stable all night, but something in the notes made her pause. His speech had been slightly slurred this morning. One eye tracking slower than the other. Post-stroke patients could be unpredictable. The brain was rewiring itself. Sometimes recovery was linear. Sometimes it wasn't. She pushed the door open quietly and found him watching the television with the sound off, images of a news anchor flickering across his face. He turned when she entered, slowly, controlled, and his eyes focused on her. Clear eyes. Sharp eyes. Eyes that had seen things. Good morning, General. I'm Katie, your nurse today. How are you feeling? Better, he said, the words slightly careful around his mouth, the stroke's residual stiffness still present. Better every day. She checked his lines, monitor leads, blood pressure cuff, while he watched her work. She was efficient. She never wasted motion. Every hand movement had a purpose. This was military training, though he wouldn't know that. This was field medicine translated into civilian care. This was someone who'd learned that every second could matter. Your breathing's been good overnight, she said, pulling out her penlight to check his pupils. Neurologically you're tracking much better than yesterday. You're good at this, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer. She just made note of his vitals and stepped back to give him space. What she didn't know was that General David Martinez was Miguel's commanding officer, and that Miguel had spent 12 months under his command in Helmand Province, and that the general had seen Katie's service record once, years ago, in a classified briefing about combat medical support. What she didn't know was that something about her posture, her efficiency, the way she moved with absolute precision and zero wasted energy, had triggered a fragment of recognition. What she didn't know was that in exactly 72 hours, he would save her life by telling one true story about something that was supposed to be forgotten. She left his room at 8:38 a.m. and walked to the locker room, where she kept her things in a narrow blue locker with a broken latch that she'd wrapped in athletic tape to keep closed. She opened it to grab the extra pair of compression socks she kept for shift changes, and there it was. The folded flag. White linen, faded from years inside a locker, with the edges creased so precisely that they looked sharp enough to cut. That flag represented someone she'd held while he died. Someone whose name she couldn't say out loud, whose existence she couldn't acknowledge, whose sacrifice had been classified into silence. That flag was the only proof that she'd been something other than a community college nurse in San Antonio. It was the only evidence that those 40 minutes under fire had actually happened, that the blood on her hands had been real, that the choice to stay instead of evacuate had meant something. She touched the corner of it, just barely, just enough to feel the linen beneath her fingertips. Then she closed the locker, wrapped the latch with athletic tape, and went back to work. The rest of the shift unfolded without incident. By noon, Katie had managed 6 patients, documented 3 medication changes for the day shift physicians, and caught a missed order that would have caused serious complications for room 334. She did these things quietly. Nobody noticed. Nobody wrote her up. Nobody thanked her. At 11:51 a.m., Dr. Pierce appeared in the nurse station with the patient chart from room 347. He stood very still, reading it. Then he looked up directly at Katie, who was charting at a terminal across the station. "The general's doing well," then, he asked. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, powerful and controlled and fundamentally dangerous. "Stable," Katie said. "No complications." He didn't look away. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Good. Keep an eye on him. Strokes can be unpredictable." He wasn't asking. He was instructing. He was establishing the hierarchy. He was doing exactly what surgeons did, taking command, making it clear that despite the skill with which she'd managed the patient, the care existed within his authority. He was claiming credit that wasn't his. Katie didn't argue. She just nodded and went back to her documentation. This was the protocol. This was how things worked in hospitals. The surgeons gave orders. The nurses executed them. The surgeons got recognized. The nurses did the work. What she didn't know was that she'd just given him the opening he needed. That by accepting his authority without challenge, by allowing him to establish dominance, she'd created exactly the kind of dynamic he despised. Because competent people, truly competent people, didn't accept his authority. They challenged it quietly. They saved patients he'd missed. They revealed, through their quiet excellence, that his credentials were often worth more than his competence. And Robert Pierce could not tolerate that kind of exposure. The shift ended at 7:15 p.m. Katie walked to her truck, climbed in, and sat in the cab with the engine off and the windows down, letting the San Antonio heat wash over her. The parking lot was half full. The hospital behind her was settling into its evening rhythms. Somewhere inside, Dr. Pierce was finishing his rounds. General Martinez was watching the television with the sound off. And Miguel was at home with his grandmother, waiting for his mother to pick him up, waiting to tell her about his day at school, waiting for the one person in his life who truly understood the weight of the things that couldn't be said. Katie turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. The dent in the driver's side caught the setting sun. She drove out of the parking lot without looking back. She had no idea what was coming. The assignments came through on a Tuesday morning. Katie watched the schedule update on the unit portal, 3 weeks of overnight shifts, all of them solo, all of them in the medical surgical unit that handled the least acute patients. The kind of work where you could disappear into routine and nobody would notice. Nobody was supposed to notice. Dr. Pierce had made the calls himself. She saw his name on the requisition form, the one requesting her reassignment away from the cardiac wing where the real medicine happened, away from the monitors and the surgeries, away from anywhere she might be useful. The intercom crackled with another admission, a post-op patient from his team, stable vitals, standard recovery protocol. She took the chart and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the fluorescent hum of the night shift wrapped around everything like a blanket that never kept you warm. The patient in 337 was 73, post-op cardiac catheterization, complaining of shortness of breath at 2:13 a.m. Katie checked the orders. Sitting elevated. Oxygen at 2 liters. Monitor the pain. Nothing that required much thinking, much skill, much anything. She read the post-op note from Dr. Pierce, clean procedure, uneventful, patient stable for discharge tomorrow. She looked at the monitor and listened to his lungs. Air moving fine on the left. The right side sounded like wind through a tunnel, hollow and wrong. She checked the X-ray from 4 hours prior. Clear bilateral lung fields. Something had changed. She palpated his chest, gentle and methodical, the way Captain Rodriguez had learned to examine trauma patients in field hospitals where you had 30 seconds and had to know everything. His breath sounded like air escaping from a tire. She ordered a stat portable chest film and called for the tech, who arrived annoyed at the middle of the night request. The film took 18 minutes to process. She waited in the hallway, still as water, knowing what she would see before the image loaded. The right lung had collapsed. Not a dramatic collapse, pneumothorax was already forming, visible as a thin dark line separating the lung from the chest wall. In 4 more hours, it would compress his heart. In 6, he would die. She called the attending on the floor. Not Dr. Pierce, the resident, Dr. Holloway, who answered on the 2nd ring, still half asleep. She described the findings, the patient's worsening oxygen saturation, the new infiltrate visible on the X-ray. Dr. Holloway said he'd be there in 5 minutes. He wasn't asking if she was sure. He was just coming. Dr. Pierce arrived first. He materialized outside the patient's room like a storm front, still in his suit pants and Columbia button-down from the day's shift, his presence making the hallway feel smaller. His eye swept the room, registered the new X-ray, registered Katie standing beside the monitor with her arms crossed. She'd learned years ago that speaking first was a mistake. She waited. "What is this?" His voice was low and smooth, the way a predator sounds when it's already won. "Pneumothorax, small right. Vitals dropping." She didn't say "I found it." She didn't say "you missed it." She simply stated fact. Dr. Pierce stepped closer to the monitor. She could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His jaw tightened. He looked at the X-ray without touching it, as if the film might bite. Then he turned to her and smiled. Not the kind of smile that reached eyes. The kind that sharpened them. "Thank you for calling this in," he said, and the words were knives wrapped in velvet. "Next time, however, remember your scope of practice. You're a nurse. You draw blood and change bedpans. Radiographic interpretation is for physicians." He paused, tilted his head. "The ER has an opening if you feel overqualified for floor nursing." Dr. Holloway arrived as Dr. Pierce walked away, already on his phone to someone, already rewriting the narrative. The resident read the X-ray, ordered the chest tube, and said he'd take it from here. Katie stepped back into the shadows where she was supposed to be. 3 days later, a write-up appeared on the unit board. Dr. Pierce had filed a formal complaint, scope of practice violation. The nurse had made a radiographic assessment without physician oversight, had suggested clinical decisions beyond her certification level, had created a climate of unsanctioned clinical judgment. It was filed with risk management. It was copied to her personnel file. It was weaponized. But that wasn't the public humiliation. That came in the morning, when the patient's family arrived. The wife, the daughter, the grandson, 3 generations in the patient's room, flowers and coffee cups, relief and exhaustion all over their faces because he was going to be okay, the pneumothorax caught in time, the damage minimal. Dr. Pierce swept in at 8:53 a.m. like he was there to deliver good news that belonged to him. Katie was documenting at the bedside, finishing her shift notes. "Your husband is incredibly fortunate," Pierce said to the wife, his voice warm and certain. "I caught a small complication during my morning rounds. A minor pneumothorax that most physicians would have missed. The good news is we've resolved it, and he'll be discharged this afternoon." He did not mention that he had missed it. He did not mention that a community college nurse had found what his years of training and his $847,000 annual salary and his name on the hospital masthead could not see. Katie stepped forward to complete the vital signs. That's when she made the mistake of being in the room. "And this is part of our support staff," Pierce said, his tone shifting like a light switch. "Nursing technician." He was lying. She was an LPN. Very dedicated, though sometimes a bit enthusiastic about overstepping. Earlier this week, she attempted to interpret imaging without proper training. A reminder that even well-intentioned nurses need supervision. He smiled at the family. Community college programs do their best, but they're not quite the same as a 4-year degree. Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. The wife's face changed, the trust that had been there a moment before, replaced with something closer to doubt. The daughter glanced at her mother, questioning. The grandson kept scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the small cruelty unfolding in front of him. Pierce waited for her to flinch. To defend herself. To say something that would make her sound desperate or emotional or unprofessional. She did none of those things. She took one slow breath. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her work, documenting the vitals in the chart as if he hadn't spoken, as if his words were already forgotten, as if he wasn't even there. "I'm going on break," she said to the wife, speaking directly to her, not through her. "Your call light is right there. Someone will be back in 3 minutes." The wife nodded, confused by the shift in attention, by the competence and steadiness in Katie's voice, by the way she'd somehow made the family feel safer by simply being professional. Pierce left the room without another word. But he was watching. He had started to see what he was actually dealing with, and it terrified him. The break room that afternoon was half empty, the ghost hours between shifts, when only the skeleton crew was working. Katie set down her lunch at the table near the window, the one that overlooked the parking lot where she'd hidden for the last 6 months, invisible and useful. She'd learned invisibility in Bagram. She could be invisible here. She had been invisible here. Until she sat down. The charge nurse looked up from her phone. The respiratory tech, mid-conversation. The medical assistant who'd been friendly for 3 months. They all registered her presence the way they might register a bad smell. Chairs scraped. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. One by one. The charge nurse said she had to check the supply closet. The respiratory tech remembered a call he needed to make. The medical assistant stood and said, "I think there's a stretcher in the hallway." Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for her and the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of something she'd learned a long time ago. Isolation was a choice, and it was also a weapon. She looked at her lunch. Turkey sandwich. Apple. Water. The same thing she'd been eating for 214 days. She didn't eat it. She wrapped it back up and sat for the remaining 8 minutes of her break, still as stone, breathing like she'd been taught, slow and controlled, the kind of breathing you did when your hands needed to be steady. When she returned to the floor, she was smiling. Not a real smile. The professional smile that had carried her through 6 months of Cedar Creek Medical, through whispers and sideways glances and the careful distance the staff maintained. She had 4 more patients to see before shift change. She had charts to finish. She had a life that didn't exist beyond the walls of this hospital, and a son at home who was waiting for her, who was sleeping while she worked nights, who was being raised by his grandmother because Katie couldn't afford childcare on a community college nurse's salary, couldn't afford to be absent, couldn't afford to be visible. Her last patient of the night was a post-op admit at 5:22 a.m. Elderly. Male. Recovering from abdominal surgery. He was on Dilaudid for pain, still groggy, still in that strange space between sedation and consciousness. His monitor showed stable vitals. He would sleep for another hour. She checked his IV, made sure his pain medication was running correctly, and was turning to leave when she heard something. A whisper. Her name. Not the name on her badge. Not the one Pierce had been using. The other one. Rodriguez. The patient's eyes were barely open, but they were focused. Searching. Looking at her face the way someone looks at a ghost they weren't expecting to see. Captain Rodriguez. The machines around them seemed to fall away. The world tilted slightly. She stepped closer to the bed, to this man whose face she now recognized as the general who had come to Bagram 12 years ago to personally decorate the fallen, who had stood in the sand with tears on his face and a folded flag in his hands, who had told the unit that these warriors had saved 3,000 lives that month alone. She didn't speak. She didn't have words that the fluorescent lights and the monitors and the early morning silence would understand. She just placed her hand over his on the blanket, and General David Martinez, her son's commanding officer, the man who had told Miguel he was a credit to his country before the IED took him, smiled like he'd just found what he'd been looking for his whole life. The monitor screamed at 2:22 a.m. Not the usual alert, not the steady rhythm of a heart compensating, adapting, surviving. This was the sound of a body in free fall, the high-pitched wail that meant something had fractured inside General David Martinez's chest cavity, and every second he stayed on this bed was a second his brain wasn't getting oxygen. Katie's eyes snapped open before she'd even finished the thought. She'd been standing at the foot of his bed, watching his vital signs climb back to normal after surgery, watching the man who'd held her son's shoulders steady and told him he was a credit to his country before the IED took that credit to a grave in Arlington. She'd been watching him sleep like he'd earned it. His trachea had shifted. Visibly. Left. 3 inches to the left, like his body was trying to cough up a secret. Tension pneumothorax. Lung collapse. Code blue in slow motion. Katie moved. Not the careful shuffle of a community college nurse following protocol. Not the hesitant step of someone afraid to overstep. Her posture changed the way a switch changes light, from deferential to commanded, from apologetic to certain. Her hands were already moving toward the crash cart before her brain finished the diagnosis, muscle memory from Bagram airfield where there was no time for hierarchy, no time for paperwork, no time for anything but the difference between a body that lived and a body that bled out on a surgical tent while fighter jets screamed overhead. Code blue, she said, but not to the call button. Not to anyone. Just to the room, the way a general says orders to the air and the air obeys. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle. Not asking permission. Not waiting. The needle glinted under the fluorescent lights like a small scalpel, and she already had the alcohol swab in her other hand, already moving to the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where the collapsed lung was pushing against his heart like a fist against glass. The code team was 2 floors away. Downstairs in the break room. Probably drinking lukewarm coffee and doing charts and not knowing that a Marine general, the kind of man who could cool down artillery strikes, the kind of man who'd seen 23 countries and their worst days, was turning blue in room 347. Katie's hands were steady as a surgical laser. Better than steady. She'd done this before, in a combat field hospital where the tent walls flapped like they were breathing and a 17-year-old from Corpus Christi was trying to whisper a message to his mother while Katie's hands held open a thoracic cavity the size of a fist. The training didn't leave. It just waited for moments like this, moments when competence was the only language that mattered. She swabbed the skin. 23 seconds to preparation. The needle went in at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to the rib cage, and the moment the tip breached the pleural cavity. The hiss. Air escaped like a confession, like relief, like survival itself releasing into the room. The lung re-inflated beneath her hands, the trachea sliding back to center, the monitor's frantic scream dropping 3 octaves into something almost human. The oxygen saturation began to climb. 68. She didn't move. Didn't congratulate herself. The needle stayed in place, creating a one-way valve, letting the excess pressure bleed out while the lung remembered how to hold air. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm back into existence. 72. The general's color was changing. The dusky blue-gray fading. His eyes were still closed, but his breathing had stopped. The desperate gasping had found something like rhythm again. 79. The code team burst through the door at 2:51 a.m., for minutes after the monitor had screamed, and they found the patient stable. Not crashing. Not circling the drain. A 14-gauge needle in place, the lung expanded, vital signs climbing like a man who'd decided to keep living. Status, the attending physician called out, already reaching for the chart. Katie stepped back. Just one step. Just enough to let them see what they needed to see: the needle, the placement, the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to save lives in a place where failure meant coming home in a box. Needle decompression, she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't asking. It was reporting. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Tension pneumothorax. Pressure released at 233. Saturation climbing from 68 to 79. Breathing stabilized. Heart rate down to 104. Numbers. Medical terminology. The language of someone who didn't learn this from a textbook, but from the kind of place you don't list on a resume. The attending looked at the needle placement. Looked at the patient's vitals. Looked at the nurse standing there in scrubs that had blood on the cuff, the general's blood, now being cleaned by the code team as they set up their own equipment, as they stabilized what was already stable. Who did this? The attending asked. Katie was already turning to walk away. Her hands were moving to her pocket, to the small pin she wore on her collar, the barely visible trident, the kind of pin that didn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't been there, hadn't stood in the dust and the heat and the sound of mortars landing 3 football fields away. Her hands found the needle, made sure it was secure. Made sure General Martinez's lung would stay expanded. Made sure the man who told her son, "You're a credit to this country," Rodriguez, would keep breathing. Just the floor nurse, she said. Quiet. Measured. The way you speak when you've already said everything that matters. But that wasn't the worst part. What the staff didn't see was the recognition flash across the attending's face, not just at the clinical competence, but at something else. The way Katie had moved. The medical terminology no community college program taught. The kind of calm that doesn't come from patient care but from standing in places where calm meant the difference between dying and going home. Someone in the code team exchanged a glance with someone else. A nurse who'd served, maybe. A tech who'd recognized the muscle memory. The way she'd given orders without asking permission. Katie walked back to the nurse's station, and her hands were shaking now. Not from fear. Not from adrenaline. From restraint. From knowing that she'd just shown more than she meant to show, revealed more than she'd planned to reveal, and that somewhere in this hospital, maybe in the monitor, maybe in the security footage, maybe in the memory of a man who'd just been brought back from the edge, there was now evidence that the community college nurse in room 347 knew things she wasn't supposed to know. And 3 doors down, in the physician's lounge where he'd been reading a cardiac journal and ignoring the code blue alert because it had nothing to do with him, Dr. Pierce was about to find out. The monitor's alarm cut through the code blue celebration like a blade through silk. 3 minutes. That's how long it took Dr. Pierce to walk from the physician's lounge to room 347, his cardiac journal still folded under one arm, his expression shifting from irritation to calculation the moment he processed the scene. The ventilator breathed its mechanical rhythm. The 4 lines ran clear. And there, standing at the bedside with the needle still poised at the second intercostal space, was the community college nurse who'd somehow managed what his own staff couldn't, a clinical save that would have required actual combat medicine training, the kind that didn't exist in civilian nursing certifications. Katie stood motionless as he entered. She didn't turn. She didn't explain. She simply withdrew the needle with the same precision that had brought the general's oxygen saturation from 68 to 94, and stepped backward into the corner of the room like a soldier clearing a room she'd already secured. Sinus rhythm, the monitor tech announced. O2 sat holding at 96. The general's eyes fluttered. His chest rose on its own. The reinflated lung had brought him his brain back, and everyone in that room understood it except for the man now staring at the empty syringe in Katie's gloved hand with the intensity of someone watching his entire career trajectory shift on its axis. Dr. Pierce didn't speak. He didn't need to. His jaw moved through a single calculation: threat assessment, damage control, narrative management, and Katie watched the decision crystallize behind his eyes like ice forming on a windshield. She knew that look. She'd seen it before in subordinate officers who'd just realized the enlisted soldier standing in front of them had more combat hours than their entire academy graduating class. Respect didn't matter. Status did. And status was something she didn't have, which meant status was something he could take from her. He left room 347 at 6:52 a.m. By 7:04 a.m., Dr. Pierce was in his office on the 4th floor, door closed, phone against his ear. His voice was steady. Conversational. The tone of a man discussing a problem, not a crisis. Chief of Staff? It's Pierce. We need to discuss the competency of our nursing staff. Specifically, one of our community college graduates performed an invasive procedure without authorization this morning. Yes. A needle decompression. No, I didn't authorize it. I arrived after the fact. A pause. Katie could almost hear the calculation on the other end. I understand that the patient survived, but we cannot allow protocol violations to be excused simply because the outcome was favorable. That's how people die, actually. When nurses decide they know better than physicians. Another pause. I've documented everything. I'm making calls to risk management and the credentialing committee. I want this in her permanent file. The phone clicked. Within 2 minutes, the second call. Risk management? Dr. Pierce at Cedar Creek. I need to report a serious breach of scope of practice. One of our nurses performed a needle decompression on a post-operative patient. Without orders. Without physician presence. It's a cardiac procedure. She's an RN from a community college program. He listened. His voice dropped lower. I'm not saying the outcome was bad. I'm saying the behavior was dangerous. And if we don't address it now, we're exposing ourselves to liability. Yes. I'll send you the details within the hour. Thank you. Click. The third call came at 7:18 a.m. Nursing Director? Pierce. I need to discuss the reassignment of one of your staff members. The nurse who was with the general in room 347. Yes, the one who performed the decompression. I don't feel comfortable with her on my service anymore. Her judgment is questionable. Her training is questionable. And frankly, her presence creates liability for Cedar Creek. He paused, listening. I'd prefer she be reassigned to a lower acuity unit where she can't override physician orders. Consider this a formal request. If she remains on my floor, I will have to document my concerns with the credentialing committee. You understand what that means for your department? No? Well, let me explain. Katie was on her 4th patient when the message came across the unit board at 8:06 a.m. A formal write-up, flagged urgent, addressed to all medical staff, nursing staff alert, scope of practice violation. On the 15th of June at 6:48, a nursing staff member performed an invasive procedure, needle decompression, 14-gauge angiocath, without physician authorization or presence. This constitutes a serious breach of hospital protocol. All staff are reminded that invasive procedures remain the exclusive purview of licensed physicians. Any future violations will result in immediate disciplinary action up to and including termination. No name. Didn't matter. Every person on the floor knew exactly who was being described. The 4th call came from the credentialing committee chair at 9:06 a.m., but Katie didn't take it. Instead, she took it from security. Ms. Rodriguez. A man in a grey shirt with a radio clipped to his belt. Behind him, another officer. Behind them both, a cardboard box with her belongings already inside, trauma shears, the extra stethoscope she'd bought herself, the half-empty container of peppermint gum. "We're going to need you to come with us. You're being escorted from the premises, pending an investigation into your credentials and scope of practice." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie removed her badge and placed it on the desk. The plastic was still warm from her neck. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply accepted the box, feeling the weight of it like a coffin lid closing, and walked through the hospital hallways that had become her refuge, past the staff members who suddenly found reasons to look away, past the break room where 3 nurses stood with their coffee cups and their careful silence, past the exit where the San Antonio heat rolled in through the automatic doors like a reminder that the world didn't care about protocols or justice or the fact that a man was still breathing. Because of her hands. She drove home without music. Without her phone. Just the sound of the highway and the understanding that the classified operation at Bagram, the one that had earned her a Navy Cross and a direct order from the Pentagon to disappear, had just become the very thing that made her defenseless. The military had erased her official existence to protect national security. They'd ordered Captain Katie Rodriguez to vanish, to become nobody, to live in shadows so deep that even her own service record was classified as never having occurred. And now, when she needed proof of who she actually was, proof of the training that had saved a Marine general's life, she had nothing. No documentation. No certificates. No official record that could be surfaced without violating orders that still held more weight than any hospital policy. The folded flag from her teammate in Bagram lay in her locker. That's all she had of her real life. That small triangle of faded red and blue, creased from being held too many times, stored in a locked compartment behind her spare shoes because to carry it openly would have been the same as wearing a target. Miguel was waiting at the kitchen table when she arrived home at 3:53 p.m. Her 7-year-old, still in his school uniform, still asking about the solar system project due Friday, still innocent of the fact that his mother had just lost her job for saving the life of the man who'd pinned his father's stripes to his uniform before his father stopped coming home. The tears came quietly. She sat at the table, and they fell into her hands, and she clutched the folded flag that she'd retrieved from her locker in those final minutes, the flag of the teammate who'd bled out in a combat surgical bay while Katie held pressure on wounds that would have required a full surgical team, not a field medic working by flashlight with donated blood and prayer. "Mommy." Miguel's voice was small. Confused. "Why are you home? Why are you crying?" She had no answer that a 7-year-old could understand. She had no words for how the Pentagon had carved her out of her own life, or how the hospital had fired her for the very competence that had been beaten into her muscle memory by for combat tours, or how she was now sitting in a kitchen in San Antonio with a folded flag and a kid who deserved a mother with a future, and all she could offer him was silence and tears and the knowledge that sometimes the people who save lives are the ones who get destroyed for it. Outside, the wind picked up. A storm was moving in from the west. Katie could smell the rain coming, that sharp ozone smell that meant the sky was about to split open. She didn't know that 3 miles away, at Cedar Creek Medical, a patient in room 347 was waking up from sedation with a general's clarity in his eyes, asking for the nurse who'd saved his life with a steady hand and a combat medic's instinct. She didn't know that a Marine general, recognizing the handiwork of someone he'd served within the Helmand province, was already making calls to the Pentagon. She didn't know that her son's father, the man whose stripes this general had pinned, a corporal named Miguel Rodriguez who'd given everything in a place called Bagram, was about to set off a chain of events that would bring the entire weight of United States military authority down on Cedar Creek Medical like a hammer on glass. All she knew was that the rain was coming, and she was holding a flag, and somewhere in the darkness of her kitchen, the bravest thing she could do was sit there and let herself break, just for a moment, before the next fight began. The hospital board convened at 8 a.m. sharp, fluorescent light catching the polished mahogany of the conference table where Dr. Pierce sat arranging his notes with the precision of a man who'd already won. He'd made his case lean and surgical, reckless procedure, scope violation, liability exposure. 6 board members nodded along as he walked them through his documentation, each point another brick in Katie's professional grave. The Chief of Staff was about to call the vote when the double doors swung open and General David Martinez rolled in, wheelchair gleaming steel, flanked by 2 Marine officers in dress blue so pressed they could cut glass. The room shifted. Oxygen seemed to redistribute itself. Dr. Pierce's pen stopped mid-sentence. "I'm here to see the nurse who saved my life," the general said. Not a request. It was a command. Katie was called in 3 minutes later, still wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a plain grey sweater because nothing else had seemed worth the effort this morning. She'd expected security. Maybe paperwork. She didn't expect the general's eyes to find her the instant she crossed the threshold, his gaze locking onto the small pin on her collar, barely visible beneath her sweater neckline. A trident. Tarnished from years of wear. Made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel from Bagram. The general's voice dropped so low only she could hear it. Valkyrie. The room stopped breathing. That name had been buried with 3 amendments to her classified file. Valkyrie was the call sign she'd earned holding a surgical bay for 40 minutes while mortars hammered the compound and every other medic was down. Valkyrie had ceased to exist when the Pentagon ordered Captain Katie Rodriguez to disappear. The word hanging in the silence now wasn't just a name, it was an indictment of every lie she'd been forced to live. One of the Marine officers stepped forward, dress cover under his arm, citation in hand. He began to read, and each word landed like a gavel strike. Captain Katie Rodriguez, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations when her field hospital came under direct fire. When her team was compromised, she maintained surgical operations for 40 minutes under active hostile conditions, preventing catastrophic casualty loss. Her actions resulted in the survival of 17 service members who would otherwise have been lost to preventable combat trauma. This heroism, performed in the face of imminent personal danger, demonstrates exceptional courage and medical competence beyond her rank and training. Dr. Pierce stood. "This is completely inappropriate. We're discussing a community college nurse who performed an unauthorized." The general raised one shaking hand. Just one hand, trembling slightly from the stroke, and Pierce's words died like extinguished candles. The Marine officer produced 2 medals. The light caught them as he held them forward, a Navy Cross and a Purple Heart. The general's hand rose to salute them, his arm steady now with something deeper than muscle memory. It was honor recognizing honor. The salute hung in the air like a question that had finally found its answer. "You've been standing next to a hero," the general said to the board, his voice measured and clear. "And you were about to destroy her." The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds. Then the IT director walked in. He was wearing a veteran's cap, army, faded from years of wear, and carrying a USB drive. He didn't ask for permission. He walked to the laptop at the conference table and plugged it in. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice held the grinding precision of someone used to giving bad news. At 11:44 p.m. last night, Dr. Pierce accessed the security system and attempted to delete footage of the needle decompression. Every frame is preserved. I've also cross-referenced his communication logs with his reported activities from the past 3 weeks. He reassigned staff without authorization, modified scheduling to isolate Nurse Rodriguez, and made at least 4 calls to allies in administration requesting her termination before she even performed the procedure that saved the general's life. The screen flickered on. Timestamp, 11:36 p.m. Dr. Pierce's hands moved across a keyboard. Hesitant. Searching. The files were highlighted in red. Delete. The cursor hovered. His face, caught in the blue glow of the monitor, showed something Katie had never expected to see: panic. Dr. Pierce lunged forward. "That footage is, you have no authority to," his voice cracked like old leather. She overstepped. She performed an invasive procedure without supervision. She endangered. Saved a life, the general interrupted. While you slept. While your pride was more important than his oxygen saturation. The general leaned forward. "You've never actually held a human heart in your hands, have you, Doctor? You've never had to choose between following protocol and watching someone die." She has. Twice. And both times she chose the person. Dr. Pierce's face went the color of old plaster. He opened his mouth. closed it, opened it again, and something seemed to break. Some carefully maintained facade crumbled, and what spilled out was rage, pure and unfiltered. He swept his papers off the table. Files scattered across the polished wood like wounded birds. "This is a setup," he screamed, and the sound was so raw, so stripped of the veneer of professionalism that everyone stepped back. "She planted that footage. She's been planning this. She knew who that patient was. His voice spiraled higher, losing control with every word. "She doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong anywhere. She's a ghost. A phantom. The Pentagon doesn't even acknowledge." Katie's voice cut through it, calm as a surgical light. "And now everyone knows why." Dr. Pierce turned on her, his face contorted. His hand came up, not in gesture, in threat, and that's when the doors opened again. 2 federal agents, badges catching light, boots on tile in a military staccato that meant everything had just escalated beyond the hospital's jurisdiction. NCIS. Navy Criminal Investigative Service. One of them was a captain herself, insignia bright on her shoulder, and the moment Dr. Pierce saw her, the color drained from his face like water from a corpse. "Dr. Marcus Pierce," the NCIS captain said, and her voice was the opposite of Pierce's, quiet, lethal, professional. "You're under federal investigation for attempted destruction of evidence, tampering with medical records, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding harassment of a commissioned officer. You have the right to remain." Dr. Pierce tried to run. He actually tried to run. He made it 3 steps before the other agent caught him, smooth and efficient, and the handcuffs snicked closed with a sound like a closing coffin. His hands behind his back. His dignity behind him. His career gone. They walked him out past the nursing staff. Not one of them looked away. Some had worked with him for years. Some had been afraid of him. Now they just watched him pass, a man who'd had everything and chosen to burn it rather than acknowledge that someone without his pedigree could be his equal. The State Medical Board received the complete file by 2:13 p.m. Evidence of fraudulent credential verification, systematic harassment, and obstruction of justice. By 3:22 p.m., his medical license was under review for permanent revocation. By midnight, he'd retained counsel. But the moment that mattered happened in the conference room, when Katie stood and the general saluted her, when every person in that room finally understood that the quiet nurse pushing their charts had held lives together in places they'd never been, under circumstances they'd never face. Captain Katie Rodriguez, decorated and classified and finally visible. The board voted unanimously to not only reinstate her but to offer her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. Katie said no. She said she wanted her old shift back. She wanted trauma patients and impossible calls and the chance to do the work that had been her real home all along. They gave her the position anyway, director-level salary, night shift rotation, full authority over emergency protocols. 3 weeks later, she was back in scrubs, standing over a 16-year-old with a stab wound to the abdomen, calling out orders with the kind of precision that made young residents stop and listen. The kid made it. The kid made it because Captain Katie Rodriguez caught the hemorrhage before it cascaded into irreversible shock. 6 months after that, the hospital board approved a new wing, the Rodriguez Memorial Trauma Center, dedicated to veteran care and named after every fallen soldier from every service branch. The ribbon cutting happened on a Tuesday afternoon. General Martinez attended. So did Miguel, now old enough to understand that his mother had never actually been erased. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. All those years, every insult swallowed, every humiliation absorbed, every moment she'd held herself to a standard that no one else could see, it had all been training. Training for this. For the moment when the world finally caught up to who she'd always been. Dr. Pierce lasted for months in private practice before his legal fees bankrupted him. By month 6, he was driving a medical supply van for a logistics company in Tucson, the kind of van that delivered bedpans and catheters to rural clinics. His name tag read, Steve. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. Most didn't. Most didn't even recognize him. The man in the medical supply van was nobody now. That was the point. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Katie didn't need the world watching anymore. She had 17 saved lives in her wake. She had a son who understood sacrifice. She had a general who'd given her back her name. And every night she went home, she folded that flag more carefully than before, because now it represented something different, not loss, but the price of choosing to be unseen until the moment you had to be seen. Subscribe for more stories about the unsung people who carry the weight of heroism in silence until the weight finally lifts. Like and comment. Have you ever been misjudged by someone who didn't know your real value?